In the fall of 1955, a phone rang in a house in Salmon, Idaho, and a man named Elmer Keith picked it up and was told that his dream had come true. The voice on the line was from Smith & Wesson. They were telling him that the revolver he had spent 30 years lobbying for was finished, that a new cartridge would be shipped to him shortly in plain, white, unmarked boxes, that the gun was largely a tool room job, but that production was well underway. Keith hung up the phone and went outside. He had spent the better part of 3 decades writing to manufacturers, badgering executives, and hand-loading his own ammunition to specifications that every commercial factory in America had told him were impossible, irresponsible, or both. The cartridge that arrived in those white boxes a few weeks later was not the cartridge he had asked for. The name on the box was not the name he had chosen. He had requested 250 grains at 1,200 feet per second. Remington delivered 240 grains at 1,500 feet per second. He had asked that it be called the 44 Special Magnum. The president of Remington Arms, a man named R.H. Coleman, named it the 44 Remington Magnum. Keith wrote later that both gun and load proved to be all he had dreamed. That sentence is the secret. That sentence is not a lie. It is the kind of sentence a man writes when he knows exactly what he received and exactly what he did not receive and has decided that the gap between them is not worth the fight. Elmer Keith spent 30 years fighting for the 44 Magnum. When Remington and Smith & Wesson finally built it behind his back, stronger than he asked for and named for themselves, he sat down and wrote that it was all he had dreamed. He carried that sentence for 29 more years until he died on February 14, 1984, at the age of 84. The cartridge his name will forever be attached to is the 44 Remington Magnum. The second word is the company that named it without asking him. The first word is the caliber. His name is nowhere on the box. You need to understand what Elmer Keith's hands had been through before you can understand what he was willing to accept. In 1911, Keith was 12 years old and living in a boarding house in Missoula, Montana, when the building caught fire in the night. By the time anyone reached him, the damage was severe. His chin was fused to his right shoulder by scar tissue that had contracted during healing. His left hand was turned completely upside down on the back of his wrist, the fingers curled back into a shape that was no longer a recognizable hand. Every doctor his father contacted refused to operate. The boy probably would not live to see 21, they said, and surgery would be a waste of resources on someone that far gone. His father was not persuaded by that argument. He went to the liquor store and came back with a bottle of 100 proof bourbon. He gave the boy enough to blur the pain, and then he set Elmer's hand on the dining room table and broke the wrist and reset it himself. Keith passed out. His father kept working. Over 2 years, wearing a special glove nailed to a board, Keith pulled the use of that hand back by force. He could rope cattle. He could hold a rifle. He could work the action of a double-action revolver as fast as any man who had ever practiced it with 2 functioning hands. He would spend the rest of his life doing that, taking what he was given, which was never quite what he asked for, and turning it into something that worked well enough to get the job done. That was not resignation. That was the pattern of a man who had learned at 12 years old that the world would not negotiate with him, only deliver something to him, and that his only choice was what to do with what arrived. Keith grew up in the frontier West before it was finished, educated by Civil War veterans and men who had known gunfighters from the last generation of that era. He became a rancher, a guide, and a handgunner of a seriousness that the firearms world had not previously seen concentrated in one person. He was not a trained engineer. He was not a ballistics scientist. He was a man who shot things with handguns in the field and recorded what happened with the honesty of someone who needed accurate results to stay alive. He had no patience for what he called the pip-squeak school of handgun cartridges, the .38 Special, which the American firearms establishment had spent 30 years telling men was adequate for all purposes, was, in Keith's view, a cartridge built for the comfort of the manufacturer and the liability protection of the lawyer. A 250-pound man hit with a .38. Special could still reach you with a knife before he understood he was dead. Keith's position was simple, and he stated it without qualification for 6 decades. Use enough gun. The question he spent his career trying to answer was what enough gun actually meant. Salmon, Idaho, 1920s through 1950s. Keith's bench was not a laboratory. It was a working surface in a ranch house in a remote part of central Idaho, where the nearest doctor was 30 miles of rough road away. He loaded on a single stage press with components he ordered through the mail or picked up in town when he made the trip. He logged every load with the obsessiveness of a man who understood that an unlabeled mistake in a pile of ammunition could kill him. He ran his heavy loads in a Smith & Wesson triple lock, an old design built for the 44 Special, which had been chambered and heat-treated in 1908 for cartridges that the factory never loaded to anything approaching Keith's pressures. He used 18.5 grains of Hercules 2400 powder under a 250-grain hard-cast semi-wadcutter bullet of his own design. Averaged velocities around 1,200 feet per second from the muzzle. The triple lock never failed. He shot that load for more than 15 years. He killed game with it. He used it for protection in country where a bear could close the distance from heavy brush to arm's reach before you heard it coming. He asked for nothing from any factory. He produced the load himself. He documented it in print in Firearms publications that went to every serious handgunner in America. He was creating a constituency for a cartridge that did not yet exist commercially, building the case load by load, kill by kill, column inch by column inch. By the late 1940s, the constituency was large enough that Keith wrote to ammunition companies and to Smith & Wesson asking them to produce a commercial version of what he was doing. The ammunition companies said no. The liability exposure from people shooting his loads in old revolvers that could not handle the pressure was too great. Keith asked for a new cartridge, a little longer than the 44 Special, so it could not be chambered in the old guns, and a new revolver built specifically for it. The companies said they would think about it. A man working cattle in Montana, or Wyoming, or Idaho in 1950 did not have a factory option for what Keith was describing. What he had was a .45 Colt with walls too thin for heavy loads, or a 44 Special with cases that the old balloon head construction would eventually separate under pressure, or a .38 that Keith dismissed without ceremony as an instrument better suited to killing annoyances than to hunting game or stopping a threat in serious country. What he needed, and what Keith had already built by hand and documented in public, was a heavy cast bullet at velocities that made the handgun a genuine hunting tool rather than a badge of intention. He needed the cartridge that Keith had proved was possible and that every factory in America had declined to make. He read Keith's columns in Guns and American Rifleman. He wrote to his representatives in Congress about the price of beef. He waited for the factory to catch up with the man in Salmon who had already solved the problem. What happened next was not what Keith understood it to be. He believed for the rest of his life that his letters and his published work and his personal lobbying of Smith & Wesson president Carl Hellstrom had finally moved the factory to act. He believed he was the first person to receive a production Model 29. He was wrong on both counts. Smith & Wesson and Remington had been working on the new cartridge and revolver without telling him. They heard him. They began the project on their own terms, on their own timeline, with their own engineers, without keeping Keith informed. The first completed Model 29 went to Remington. The second went to General Julian Hatcher, the technical editor of American Rifleman. Keith received the third. He wrote in his personal correspondence, in a letter dated July 27, 1975, that he had gone home from his last meeting with Hellstrom, doubting the project would ever happen. Unbeknownst to him, as that letter later said, both Remington and Smith & Wesson were at work. The cartridge Remington built was not the cartridge Keith specified. Keith had asked for a 250-grain bullet at 1,200 feet per second in a longer case. Remington produced a 240-grain bullet at 1,500 feet per second. Lighter bullet, 300 feet per second faster, 300 additional foot-pounds of muzzle energy. It was more powerful than what Keith requested. The case length was 1/8 of an inch longer than the 44 Special, rather than the 1/10 of an inch Keith had specified. The load Remington produced was so violent in the original 39-ounce test frames that the frames had to be redesigned, and the gun gained 9 ounces before it went to market. Remington's load in the original test gun was so punishing that the engineers who shot it during development did not want to shoot it again. It was, in one documented description, a brute. It was not what Keith asked for. It was better on paper and worse in the hand than the load he had spent 15 years developing and trusting. The name decision was the cleaner wound. Keith wanted to call it the 44 Special Magnum, the name that preserved the cartridge's lineage and acknowledged the work he had done inside the older case for decades. R. H. Coleman, the president of Remington Arms, decided that naming it the 44 Remington Magnum was the right commercial choice. The word Remington went on the cartridge. The word Special, which would have pointed toward Keith's work and the long lineage of the 44 Special community that had been developing this load for 30 years, did not. Keith never said publicly, in any forum that has been found in the written record, that he was unhappy with the name. He accepted it. He called it his 44 Magnum. He carried a pair of them with 4-inch barrels for the rest of his life. The cartridge that bore his name in common usage, but not on the box, became the most famous handgun cartridge in American history. You already know where you stand on this. You have always known. A man who spends 30 years building the case for something, who proves it is possible in his own shop with his own materials and publishes every step of the proof in public, who lobbies the manufacturers directly with data and results and his own documented field records, who does everything except the commercial production, and then receives a phone call one day telling him it has been done without him, in a form slightly different from what he asked for, under a name chosen by the company that built it, has received something and lost something in the same moment. Keith received the 44 Remington Magnum. He lost the 44 Special Magnum. He received a cartridge stronger than he specified. He lost the name he chose. He received credit in common usage that everyone understands. He lost acknowledgement from the institution whose name went on the box. Remington got rich from the 44 Remington Magnum. Keith got a gun and a phone call. That is not a sentence about malice. Remington built the thing. Their engineers worked out the final specifications. Their metallurgists developed the brass. Their loading machinery produced the first commercial ammunition. The work was theirs, and the name was their right. What belonged to Keith was the 30 years of public advocacy, the field results that proved the concept was viable, the constituency he built among American handgunners, without which no manufacturer would have had a market to sell into. What he received for those 30 years was attribution in the popular record, but not on the product. Both things are true, the box, says Remington. The need for the box was created by Keith. There is a Smith & Wesson Model 29 in a gun case in a sporting goods consignment shop in Boise, Idaho, right now. It was made in 1962. It has a 6.5-inch barrel, blue finish, and wooden grips worn smooth from years of handling. The man who originally bought it is not known. It has passed through 3 or 4 hands since then, based on the scratches on the barrel crown that suggest careful use over a long time. The price tag is higher than any factory revolver of its era has a right to be, because the name 44 Magnum carries the weight of the man who refused to die in a Missoula boarding house in 1911 and refused to accept a .38 Special as adequate for the country he lived in and refused to stop writing about it until someone with a commercial factory listened. The man who owns the consignment shop could not tell you the name Elmer Keith without looking it up. He knows the cartridge. He knows the Model 29. He has heard the Dirty Harry line many times and can recite it without prompting. The film came out in 1971. Keith had been shooting a hand-loaded version of what the film made famous since before the Second World War. The consignment shop owner does not know that. Everyone knows the cartridge. Almost nobody knows the man who made the cartridge necessary. That revolver was built for a cartridge that came in a box stamped 44 Remington Magnum. That cartridge was produced by engineers at Remington Arms in 1955, working from specifications derived in part from the published work of a man who had been loading the parent cartridge to dangerous pressures in a shop in Pruz, Idaho, since the 1920s. That work had been published under Keith's name for 3 decades before the factory agreed to do it commercially. The factory put its name on the product. Keith put his name on the work that made the product necessary. One of those names is on the box. The other one is on 30 years of columns and handload tables and field reports and letters to executives who eventually listened. Keith knew which name went where. He never said it was wrong. He wrote that both gun and load proved to be all he had dreamed. He carried that sentence to his grave on February 14, 1984. He was 84 years old. He had a stroke in 1981 that ended his ability to write. He died knowing what the box said and knowing what the box did not say. 2 men at a gun counter somewhere in Idaho or Montana in 1963. One of them is buying a box of 44 Remington Magnum and explaining that Remington built the most powerful handgun cartridge in American history and that the Model 29 is the finest revolver Smith & Wesson ever produced. One of them is also buying a box of 44 Remington Magnum and explaining that the man who made either of those statements possible had been loading this cartridge in a Smith shop in Salmon for 15 years before Remington decided to do it commercially and had asked for a different name and a different bullet weight and had received a phone call from a company that had been working on his idea behind his back. Both of them paid Remington for the box. Remington's name is on the box. Keith's name is on the back of every handloading manual that drew on his 30 years of published data to tell readers what the cartridge was capable of. The box says 44 Remington Magnum. The 30 hard years of fieldwork and published handload data that made the box necessary says something else entirely. Keith. The 44 Special Magnum he never got to name. The phone call that arrived when the work was already done without him.